Today we are joined by legal historian and filmmaker Mark Weiner to discuss his latest project, The Volunteers Mountain Rescue Brings Us Home. This compelling film traces the unexpected connection between two mountain rescue organizations, one based near Seattle, Washington, and the other in Tyrol, Austria. As we uncover the origins and significance of their life-saving work, we learn that before you can save a stranger, you must first love your home. The Volunteers is set to premiere as the opening night film at the 2024 Salzburg Mountain Film Festival on November 13th, showcasing the spirit and heroism of these remarkable communities. Mark Weiner is not only a wilderness EMT, but also professor of constitutional law at Rutgers University and a Fulbright graduate to Iceland, Sweden, and Austria. He holds a J.D. from Yale Law School and a Ph.D. in American Studies from Yale University, and earned his A.B. in American Studies from Stanford University. Welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us to share more about your fascinating project.
Thank you, Pia. I'm glad to be here and glad to be linked up digitally with Salzburg, one of my wife and my very favorite places in the world.
My first question is, what inspired you to research cultural differences and history in mountain rescue services between Austria and the United States? I understand that the TV series Bergretter, your training to become an outdoor paramedic, love for hiking played a role. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Well, there are a lot of inspirations. The core inspiration is one that concerns the department where you're studying, and that is philosophy. The ultimate inspiration for me to examine the mountain rescue services was the world of ideas, and in particular, a traditional conflict that exists in social and political philosophy, especially, I would say, since roughly 1945, that is the end of the war, between an emphasis or a concern, a valorization of social, cultural, and geographic particularism, the kind of particularism that in Germany and Austria comes from the 19th century Romantic inheritance, and a universalism that's concerned most with global human solidarity and the breaking down of borders and boundaries of various kinds. And it was partly a concern with those ideas and some political philosophers that are involved in debates between these two traditionally opposed political poles that made me wonder whether there were civil society institutions that provided a framework for thinking about these questions that could, or thinking about this conflict that could help resolve it. And that then leads, I guess, to two other points of inspiration for me for the film, in addition to the personal inspiration that I brought to it, namely that I was trained in wilderness medicine and spent time in Austria in the mountains. First is that I'm American, and we have a tradition of intellectual concern for voluntaristic civil society institutions at the heart of our social and political tradition. The touchstone for that kind of thinking is Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So I'm always been concerned with civil society institutions. And finally, television, culture, film, those things influence me deeply. And one of the interesting aspects in the history of both German language and English language television, especially I would say German language television, is there is an interesting, if not always appreciated, connection between mountain rescue and community and national self-understanding. So there are a variety of television shows in which the saving of strangers in the mountains provides a way of thinking about the nature of the community itself. whether it's, just to take two examples, the great series Bergretter, takes place in Ramsau, originally, I believe, called Bergwacht. Bergretter with Andreas Marthaler provides a very interesting reinterpretation and extension of the tradition of the Heimatfilm in German language cinema. You may not know, not many people appreciate this, the very first television series of the former DDR, the first officially commissioned television series of the former DDR was called Rote Bergsteiger. And the very first episode of Rote Bergsteiger concerned a rescue in the mountains in ways that establish narratively some of the basic themes of the series in relation to the glories of East Germany. So I guess those would be some points of inspiration: philosophy, civil society institutions, television, and then my own background as a wilderness EMT.
You're also an established author, so why did you choose to film a documentary rather than write a book on the subject? Is it something that's very common at the moment in science these days to make documentaries instead of writing books? Or was it perhaps the difference for the audience experience that inspired you? So
Yeah.
Can you give us any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. No, it's not at all typical, partly because it's such a long, involved, and rather different kind of process than writing a book. I'm always interested in doing new things. I always have been, and I've always been interested in exploring different media in which to present ideas. And I think you learn something about the world by expressing yourself in different media. So I've curated museum exhibits, I've published some poetry on historical themes, and thought, well, let's make a film. And partly I'm from Los Angeles, so that kind of thinking about film comes naturally. But it's not simply a desire for novelty. I think there are things that film can express especially well, if not uniquely well, over prose. So I wanted to learn about the world in ways that film enables a person to learn. And then I wanted to be able to reach people who might not otherwise read an academic article, but who would be happy, I hope, to sit down for a couple of hours and watch the volunteers. I should say also that film as a medium plays an important role in the film itself, because the philosophical themes that we're addressing about the meaning of the mountains were developed in the German-speaking world, especially through cinema. And in some ways, the film is an effort, that is the volunteers, is an effort to address and to overcome the kind of way of thinking about the mountains that's expressed most dramatically in the German Bergfilm and in the works of, say, Leni Riefenstahl. And so to engage the themes that someone like Riefenstahl developed and to try to say something different, I think is best done in the medium of film itself.
What filming techniques did you use for the documentary? I think you mentioned that the work of Ozu, I hope I pronounced that right, inspired you in some sequences. I don't know if I got that right, but could you explain it a little bit more?
Sure. Well, let me just I'll give a brief answer to that in ways that could be interesting to you. In Austria, when we were filming in Austria, we filmed on a tripod. So everything is still and calm. And in America, most of our filming was handheld. So there's a lot of jittery motion. And that choice is deliberate, and it has thematic significance. And what we wanted to do in filming, especially on a tripod in Austria, is to project the sense of inner calm that is essential to mountain rescue work, the kind of rescue work that we think is so important socially and politically, because it provides a framework for thinking about society as a whole, a framework that can help resolve all sorts of contradictions in our thinking today. So we wanted to project that sense of inner calm that is an essential part of the Mountain Rescue Service itself. And we also wanted to, through that kind of aesthetic stability, we wanted to reference the idea that Austria is a much more stable and changeable society than the United States, which is still in the process of development. You're a more traditional society than we are. And that's reflected aesthetically as well.
How do cultural differences between Austria and America shape the public attitudes and policies regarding mountain safety and rescue operations? So can you tell us a little bit more about the differences or maybe surprising similarities between the mountain rescue efforts?
The similarities are much more interesting than the differences. And the most interesting similarity, to my mind, between mountain rescue in Austria and the United States is the contrast between public perceptions of what rescuers are willing to do and the reality of what they are willing to do. And in particular, a public perception of the Mountain Rescue Service that's common in both countries is that rescuers are, quote, willing to lay down their lives to save the lives of others. And that's not true. It's essential for rescuers that they come home alive to their families. And there's no sense in which those rescuers are eager to sacrifice themselves. And yet, there's a very strong public desire to see them in that way. And that, I think, is fascinating, because for the rescuers, many rescuers will themselves say, and I think this is correct, that the word hero is totally wrong. It's totally false to call these folks heroes, because heroes, as one of our characters from Tyrol says in the film, heroes normally don't live for very long. That's heroism. And I would say that the Mountain Rescue Service, one reason that the Mountain Rescue Service, in my view, is so important, especially after 1945, is that it expresses a culture of commitment, of total commitment to a place and to a community without a culture of total self-sacrifice that's involved in traditional notions of heroism. So how can you be committed to where you are and to that community totally without engaging in the kind of sacrificial behavior that comes out of traditional ideals of heroism, especially mountain heroism, and yet at the same time, there's a public desire to see mountain rescue in those kind of heroic terms. So, for instance, Bergretter, the German ZDF film. In, I think it's season 6, Andreas Martaler, the hero of the film, the Austrian hero of the film, he willingly lays down his life to save the life of a young Austrian girl. You may remember this episode in which he cuts his own rope. Yes, he cuts his own rope and plummets. He's swinging by a rope with a young girl, and the rope won't hold them both. And he calls up to his friend, this is in this moment of high melodrama, who's at the top of the cliff. He says, "You know what must be done." And Martaler cuts his own rope and plunges in a Christ-like pose into the valley below. It's crazy. There's no sense in which this kind of thing, this kind of thinking animates the actual mountain rescue service in Austria or the United States, and yet there is that public desire to see it that way, and that's a desire on the part of viewers and the part of the public that is, I think, a shadow desire for community and for thick webs of social interconnection and interpersonal commitment.
Very important theme of the film is the warmth in volunteer work in the organizations. What role does volunteerism play in Austria and the United States for mountain rescue units, and how do people view that work? How does it contrast between like friendly community or like a very serious work environment?
Volunteerism is an essential component of a liberal political society, a society in which not all services are provided by government, but instead are provided by local communities themselves working on their own behalf and on behalf of the values that they think are important. So volunteerism is vital to making our communities sustainable. So this is one reason why civil society institutions that are based entirely on voluntary commitments of community members are so important, both in Austria and in the United States. Two nations with very important, strong volunteer traditions. And that's especially true, you won't be surprised, in the English-speaking world, in the Anglo-American world, because the Anglo-American world has a longer, more deep philosophical commitment to liberal political organizations in which the state plays a less central role. And so typically, this is something that's very difficult to measure and very contested in social science. But if you look to most measures of volunteerism, the English-speaking world, the Anglo-American world, always outpaces the rest of the globe. So, for instance, the United States typically is off the charts in terms of volunteer commitment. Austria is very strong as well, but Australia, Canada, the UK, the United States typically rank globally as among the highest places for volunteerism. And that has to do, I think, in part with our liberal political traditions. It's also very strong in Austria too, having to do, of course, with your liberal political traditions and also the deep sense of community that you have in your country.
Could you give us a little bit of a more detailed answer on the legal and philosophical perspective, and how do mountain rescue operations reflect on those broader societal values and legal principles as well in Austria and the United States?
Sure. By the way, just a side remark that might be interesting to you and your listeners. Do you know what state in the United States has the highest commitment to civic volunteerism?
Considering in like religious participation, maybe southern states?
Well,
I don't
well,
know.
well done. Very interesting. Yeah, you're absolutely on the right track. It's Utah. The Latter-day Saints of the Mormon Church has absolutely the highest volunteer rates, no matter how you measure them, in America. So there's very strong connection between religious commitment, also commitment to communities that exist outside of government, and voluntary work. Mountain rescue organizations are, I think, special and especially important volunteer civil society institutions because they are committed above all to place and to local geographic self-understanding. Other voluntary groups are incredibly important, of course, and they're embedded in local communities in ways that are equally rich. But it's the fact of a commitment to territory, to place, that I think is especially interesting from a philosophical and legal philosophical point of view, and why I think mountain rescue organizations provide a framework for thinking about social and political problems that can help resolve some of the tensions that have existed in liberal political societies, whether in Europe or North America or elsewhere in the world, especially since 1945, because they bridge a commitment to place, to locality, to community, with a commitment to universal solidarity.
Goes right into the next question, actually, that's about history. So, with the historical background of the mountain rescue services, that's also very important in your film. And I
Yes.
wanted to know a little bit more about the specifics of the historical development in both like Austria and America that contributed to the development of the organizations and volunteerism. And maybe were there some historical significant events that formed those communities or shaped those mountain rescue practices and policies?
Sure. I think for the film, as for the development of mountain rescue, both in Austria and the United States, there are two interesting, important historical transformations. One is the development of modern tourism. That's really central to the development of mountain rescue in both countries. And then, and this is important for the film, though also for mountain rescue groups, it's the World War II and the end of World War II in the following ways. In Austria, 19th century tourism, especially from Britain, and the development of culture of alpine tourism in your country leads to the development of the modern mountain rescue service. And beginning in the earlier part of the 20th century, the effort of the Alpine Association, which had originally organized the Bergrettung, to occupy the field of mountain rescue and to push out other possible groups under which mountain rescue might have been organized. In any case, it's tourism, beginning with tourism from Great Britain, that spurs the development of organized mountain rescue services. That's true in the United States as well. But our mountain tourism develops especially after World War II, when GIs who have returned from both Europe and the Pacific, but especially Europe, where they've developed a whole lot of alpine experience by fighting in the mountains, come home and they turn to the outdoors as places to relax, to spend their time. And increasing numbers of especially returning GIs and their families who are recreating in the outdoors spurs the development of mountain rescue in the United States in the same way that it did in Austria in the late 19th century. There's another way in which, though, the war is important for the development of mountain rescue in Austria, and that is after the war, what was then, during the NS-Zeit, the unified Bergrettungsdienst or Bergwacht under the Alpine Association for Germany and Austria, annexed into Germany, that ends. And when the war ends, the German and the Austrian mountain rescue associations are separated. And in Austria, two things happen that I think are especially interesting from a historical perspective. The first is that the essentially police-like functions of the Bergwacht, Blumenpolizei, and similar police functions of the Bergwacht are separated from the Bergrettungsdienst. And so the Bergrettung in Austria becomes an association purely about the provision of care for others. And its police functions are taken up by other organizations. And I think that's interesting philosophically. The second thing that happens when the war ends and the four powers remain in Austria, the Bergrettung is reorganized not on a national level, but on a regional level. This is partly because there are challenges communicating and traveling between the regions. And so it's the existence of the four powers in Austria after the war that influences the Bergrettungsdienst to remain highly regional rather than national. And that regionalism is, I think, essential for the spirit of the Mountain Rescue Service in Austria today remaining highly local. It is in Germany as well, of course. But I think that's really important because as a civil society institution, what the Mountain Rescue Service does is it bridges the local and the international. So there has to be, what's important philosophically is that the rescue service have a strongly local consciousness. And the war, ironically, fosters that as well.
I would like to ask you a couple more questions on maybe about the filmmaking progress, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So one question would be, what were the main problems or challenges you and your team faced during or maybe even after the research and the filming process? Maybe some weather problems, legal aspects, or problems in editing, etc.
Well, anytime you involve law, there's always problems. So of course there are problems there. That's especially true right now as we deal with legal rights and permissions for music. But really the most difficult challenge, I think, of making the film was physical. We were affected by being in the mountains during production. It's hard to be up there, and especially for camera operators to be carrying gear. But even if you're not carrying gear, the mountains are a really challenging environment in which to work, and that certainly affected all of us. There are other challenges that I think are characteristic of any documentary film, and that is the balance that one needs to strike as a filmmaker between having your own idea and conception of what makes something important, but then also being respectful of the people that you're filming. That's a challenge. Also a challenge, there's another challenge with the audience of the film or our potential audience. We found that many people, when they heard that we were making a film about the rescue service, expressed a clear desire of wanting to see a dramatic story of heroism. And that's not what this film is or was ever meant to be. It's a philosophical film, and in that sense, it pushes against expectations. It is countercultural you could say. It's sort of like the Mountain Rescue Service itself. And I think that was certainly an aesthetic challenge, needing to craft a film that would be meditative, quiet, thoughtful, and yet treat a subject that in most people's minds is anything but that. Yeah. This is, by the way, that was a challenge much more so, I think, among our audiences or potential audiences in America as opposed to Austria. I found that Austrians are much more comfortable in imagining a film about the Mountain Rescue Service that meditates quietly on its philosophic significance, as opposed to theater goers in the United States. And that may also have to do with the differences in film culture between the two countries.
Did it actually come, or how did you come to work with the University of Innsbruck for the English and German translation of the film?
I am just so thrilled about that aspect of the project because I think it's totally consistent with what we've been doing all along, not only because they are providing the translation on a volunteer basis, but also because the work that they're doing symbolizes the kind of connections between the United States and Austria, and connections among people that are central themes of the film. And I came, I don't know how I was put in touch with the teacher, with the instructor at the University of Innsbruck, but what I think is wonderful about the Innsbruck program in translation is that they have a specialty in film and media translation, which is its own special beast and requires very special skills. And I'm just so happy that we were able to forge that connection. They're, by the way, going to be speaking. The students are going to be speaking, I believe, on November 15th at an event that we're holding at Das KINO to talk about the film. And I think they'll be talking about the process of translation and some of the special challenges that they had in undertaking it. Among others, for instance, the question about how to translate themes of home and Heimat in ways that make sense in both German and English.
Another question about the filmmaking progress would be, what was your highlight for you upon completing this project, and what was your favorite experience of the whole filmmaking progress?
My goodness.
Process?
Well, I'll tell you what was the highlight for us in the filmmaking process was being accepted into the Salzburg Film Festival. That really was the highlight, and to be able to open the festival on its first night, this is just terrific. It's perfect for us and for the film because Salzburg is a university town with a lot of mountains and also a lot of music, which is central to the film. That is not simply that music that we use music in the film, but music is central thematically to the film because we implicitly compare the process of mountain rescue and what mountain rescue does for a community to the process of making art, including music. So to play in Salzburg, to play at the film festival there is for us a real highlight. I should say that when I was teaching in Salzburg, my wife and I lived on Steingasse, which is just down the road from Das KINO, where the film will be screened. And I used to walk by Das KINO every day and think to myself, my goodness, wouldn't it be incredible if one day I had a film that could play in das KINO? And now it's happening, and I can't believe it, and I can't say how pleased I am.
I have one last question. That is, what do you hope your viewers will take back home from your documentary about the intersections of history, culture, and emergency responses about in mountain regions? And what is the central message you want to communicate with this film?
What do we hope that viewers will take away from the film? I think is captured by our tagline. That is, to save a stranger, first love your home. That is, that there is a way of thinking about place that implicates a commitment to universal human solidarity, and that universal human solidarity is possible and sustainable only with and through a love of place. And that bridge is constructed by the actions, by the implicit thinking of the Mountain Rescue Service. And that's, I think, the core of the meaning, the social and political meaning of the Bergrettung. Also, another thing to take home is keep calm. That's a good idea generally. That's also true in social and political terms. Keep calm and keep each other warm.
That's a very sweet way to end it. So thank you for taking the time to join us for the interview and answering all our questions. Do not forget to grab tickets for the opening night of the movie in Salzburg on the 13th of November at 7 p.m. at das KINO. There will also be a screening at the Cinematograph Leo Kino in Innsbruck on November 20th. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope you see you soon.